Hello, patrons, and welcome to another bonus episode of Beyond the Breakers. Thanks for being here with us in this September 2022 bonus episode. Taylor, how's it going?
Pretty good. I liked that intro. It had the energy of Count Olaf in the Netflix series of unfortunate events.
Oh, no.
He always greets the children with like a hello, children.
Yep, we're here for another bonus episode. We recorded our main episode yesterday. And this episode is a kind of a different type episode. It does result in a shipwreck. We will take a long and winding road to get there.
I like that anytime we do an episode that isn't just pure shipwreck, we're like, all right, now this one's a little different.
We will talk about the shipwreck for about probably 30 seconds.
Okay.
So this bonus episode is taken primarily from one article. This article is called The Short Life of the Richard A. Bingham, a Pensacola lumber schooner. This is from the fall 2000 edition of Florida Historical Quarterly. Another article from the same author, Jan Richard Heier, appeared in the Accounting Historian's Journal.
That sounds boring.
You go to the dentist office and the only option, the Accounting Historian's Journal.
That I just can't imagine what kind of writing goes on. Like accountants noted for writing, right?
That was from June 1999. That article covers more of the technical accounting practices. So that's something that we'll share on Patreon if you're interested. I read through it. It covers this ship and a few others, just kind of comparing the accounting practices of the day.
That is really interesting. Like, I guess how it plays out, but like the actual nuts and bolts behind it, like that is exceptionally dry historical reading.
Right. So I'll share that. I didn't really take too much from it for this episode. The first article is much more of a historical narrative, and that's kind of what caught my attention about this. But just kind of to point out at the beginning, this is a ship that, is written about in multiple publications, primarily focused on accounting. So that's kind of why she's remembered.
Okay.
This is an episode I've been working on for a long time. I feel like well over a month I've been trying to put this together and then just like not finishing it on time and not being able to record it. So it's finally here. This is kind of like my baby. So I hope it's good. Although sometimes children suck, like ask Henry II. We're discussing a ship today with an exceptionally short life. 350 days to be exact.
Okay. So like longer than the Titanic, but shorter than what you'd really ideally hope for.
Mm-hmm. But some of the things that happened to the ship in that time period are pretty crazy. I mean, kind of makes sense. A ship who only lasts 350 days, probably some crazy stuff happened to her.
I mean, the real problem is the whole crew is accountants.
Right. Well, not right, but sounds good. So first, let's talk about the setting of our story today. So we're going to be talking first about the city of Pensacola, Florida. And we're focused here on this area around the turn of the 20th century.
I like to think that Florida Man still exists at this time. Like he's just doing stupid stuff, but like in a bowler hat. Like
it's a timeless figure. It's like the clown from It. It's like it exists throughout time and space.
Like he's got a bowler hat and like just like a unbuttoned white dress shirt, like a raccoon chilling on his shoulder, fights alligators. Like Florida Man is timeless. He's existed forever.
The raccoon has its own raccoon-sized bowler hat.
Like if you go back and look at like Seminole lore, like there is still Florida Man like within Seminole lore.
Yes, Andrew Jackson. So the article goes into a description of Pensacola as a boom town centered around a few different industries. The biggest actual export item was cotton.
Okay.
So coming from Alabama and Georgia, destined for textile mills in New England and Great Britain.
Some things are timeless.
New England and Old England. In terms of the local economy, though, the most important industry was lumber. Most of that being pine lumber. There were about a dozen sawmills in the Pensacola area around the turn of the century, and they were one of the region's biggest employers. So quoting from that Jan Richard Heier article, between 1900 and 1904, the port exported more than 2 billion board feet of lumber, worth more than $15 million. Nearly 50% of all wood products shipped out of ports along the Gulf of Mexico went through Pensacola. 2/3 of the locally produced lumber was exported to Great Britain and Europe aboard ocean steamers.
Interesting. That's not something I was really aware of, how big the lumber trade was, especially to Europe.
So much like what we talked about with the Fraser River Gold Rush, when these towns spring up around one industry, you've also got pretty fertile ground for related supporting businesses too. Pensacola was referred to as a boom town at the time, though that wasn't exactly something that the city elites really cared for. Quoting from that same article, according to those same city elites, her growth was simply the result of legitimate business enterprise. My legitimate business enterprise t-shirt is raising a lot of questions already answered by my t-shirt.
I definitely like that. That's
But you can see probably if you're like one of the great and good of Pensacola, you probably don't want this place referred to as a boom town.
Yeah, and I think you're out of that era almost, aren't you? Like, it's not like the 1880s, like, expansion out west.
So it sounds almost anachronistic and backwards to call it that.
Mm-hmm.
So at this point, enter our main character for the day, the Richard A. Bingham. So that is the ship we'll be discussing.
Okay.
So she was a wooden-hulled, single-decked, three-masted schooner. She was fitted out in October 1902 and officially launched on January 10th, 1903.
It's pretty late for a three-masted schooner, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. And we'll actually kind of talk about that a little bit, the contrast of a pure sailing vessel at the time when steamers are more and more the dominant form of trade here. She was about 90 feet in length, 26 feet in beam, and she displaced about 90 gross tons. She was constructed at a total cost of $7,355. So let's talk about the man behind the vessel, Fraser Franklin Bingham. He's described as our favorite type of thing, a, quote, self-made man.
Of course.
He wasn't from the Pensacola area originally, but rather from Yankee Springs, Michigan.
Okay.
So we can see here, much like modern icon Kid Rock, we have this guy trying to be a big deal in the South while actually hailing from Michigan.
That is one of my favorite Kid Rock things, is that he channels like every bit of Alabama that he can. But it's like, you're from Michigan. Stop it.
So after graduating business school in St. Louis, he moved to Pensacola in 1890, presumably to take advantage of these growing opportunities in this area.
Wait, so this man has lived in like all of like the places we kind of make fun of. He's from Michigan. He goes to the land of no culture, St. Louis, and then he moves to Florida.
He's the perfect man.
I say this as living in Ohio, but like, come on, St. Louis. Like,
he's a mythical figure. So he got in as a clerk and stenographer with the Southern States Land and Timber Company. He was, quote, a man of ability, foresight, and conscientiousness, with excellent organizing skills and executive ability. He was able to take the initiative in the business. By 1900, he'd been named a director in the company, and by 1903, he was the company's assistant manager. So as Bingham is rising through the ranks of the Southern States Land and Timber Company, he's also got a little side hustle. He's on his grind set here.
I was going to say, he's grinding. He's, getting better every day.
And this is the shipping industry that he's getting into.
Okay.
So he and his father started the A.R. Bingham and Son Shipping Company for this purpose.
Do you think he watched a couple Andrew Tate videos and like got ready and he's like, I need to grind?
At first, this was mainly the consignment trade, moving goods like coffee, sugar, nutmeg, and pineapples.
I got a shipment of nutmeg that I need moved now.
Hell yeah. Consignment was profitable, but also pretty risky. So the Binghams decided to enter the lumber shipping trade. That article, it shows some of the money aspects of the consignment industry or the consignment trade. And you see, they'll have, a voyage that has a profit of, $300-$400. Then they'll have one that maybe loses $200 or $300. So
is that because of like the perishable items and stuff, and like lumber just isn't, or does
that seemed to be one aspect of it? Things can go wrong. Like there's a lot more variables going on.
Your crew mutinies and throws all your plants overboard.
Right. So in 1899, the father and son pair purchased their first ship for the purpose of carrying lumber. This was the Davy Crockett, and it set them back about $4,500.
My second favorite thing named Davy Crockett. My first favorite thing is the personal nuke that was a thing.
I was going to say
50s or 60s.
At first, I was thinking like Davy Crockett, like the.
No, he's my third favorite.
Okay, but yeah, I forgot about the personal nuke.
It's like literally the Fat Man from Fallout.
Mm-hmm. I think we talked about that in the Duck Boat episode.
I think we did. I don't know why.
It was because we were talking about other zany inventions coming out of the World War
time
II
period.
into the Cold War. So in 1902, the star of our show, the Richard A. Bingham, was constructed to further expand their business. The ship was actually named for Fraser Bingham's youngest son, who at the time was a literal baby.
Wow.
That's a lot of pressure.
Yeah, that is on a name.
On a little baby. And on the ship, I guess.
Oh, hopefully the baby lasted longer than the ship.
Well, and hopefully the baby doesn't grow up to be someone terrible.
Right. Yeah, exactly. What if you had like the SS Jeffrey Dahmer and like you named it when he was little and then
right. Yeah, you don't know what that baby's going to do.
Uh-huh.
So, a lot of pressure on this little child. So the article notes how the launching of the ship wasn't even mentioned in the maritime section of the Pensacola Daily News, which is probably just indicative of how many ships are operating at the time and how unnewsworthy the launching of a new ship from a pretty unrenowned shipping company would be.
But also, like, people live in Florida where there's other things to do. Like, if you live in the middle of nowhere, Michigan, like, launching a ship's just probably, like, the biggest news item, right?
Probably. So most of their outbound shipping was products from Southern States lumber. I don't totally understand the business setup here. I don't know if it's quite a conflict of interest, but it strikes me as weird that you could start a side company while working for this company that ships that company's products. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know.
That is interesting.
It seems like that seems like a definite like ethical gray area there.
I feel like in the 1900s, we're just like, what is ethics?
Yeah. That science is still being developed.
Yeah, like we're working on that.
So typically the pine wood would be sent to the Caribbean and Central America, and mahogany would be brought back and sold to local businesses.
That's funny. We're like, here's the cheap, crappy wood. Give us the good stuff.
Trading those basically for use in different things. We've talked about mahogany's use in shipbuilding in earlier episodes, and it was a very desirable wood. So among these mentioned in the article are these companies they work with are Parody and Sons, which is presumably a serious business despite the name, and
oh no, no,
I'm gonna pronounce this name. Mengel and Company.
I don't think that's the original pronunciation.
It's missing one E from being Mengele. So I don't know what kind of people he's working with here.
They specialized in the Argentinian trade. They spent a lot of time down there.
I don't know. Anyway, Mengel and Company. As a newcomer to Pensacola and an increasingly successful businessman, Bingham made himself an active part of local society. He married local in 1896 to Fanny Augusta Erting. This couple would have 7 children total, the second of which was young Richard.
I think it's interesting that he makes himself a part of the community. Mm-hmm. We kind of talked about that in one of the older episodes up in Michigan about someone who, he's like a local robber baron, basically, but he puts his money into community hospitals and, actually is part of the community and isn't just using tax breaks like Jeff Bezos or being the total boy like Elon Musk. You know what I mean? It's just interesting how the well-to-do were more plugged into their local community.
Yeah, I mean, as long as you get in with the community, you can do pretty much whatever you want. You could even extend that to someone like an Al Capone.
Yeah.
As long as elements of the community see you as a good guy, you can get away with a lot. In order to further his connections, he did become a member of 2 shadowy, insidious organizations.
Is he like a low-level boss you'd have to execute in Assassin's Creed?
One of them being the Masons. He's a member
Oh,
of
okay.
the
Well, there's
local
my
Masonic
answer.
Lodge. The other, the Young Men's Christian Association, also known as the YMCA.
I feel like the YMCA was a little different back then.
I know they've existed for a long time, but it's just funny to think of like a big YMCA building, but in 1903, like what that would have looked like.
It's like so different, like the YMCA, like back in the day, how it was like men's boarding rooms and stuff. Like it's just such a different organization than it is in its current form.
Yeah, it's fun to stay there.
It gets weird that they pivoted to like, we're a gym.
So as a member of the Pensacola Chamber of Commerce, he, quote, kept in touch with the general trend of business advancement of his day and actively supported many progressive business projects. His work in the city was both constructive and far-sighted, with a focus on public growth and municipal development. These business and community activities allowed him to develop many social contacts and gained for him the esteem and confidence of all with whom he came in contact. This is particularly interesting about him personally. He did all this as a Republican in what was a heavily Democratic area.
We should note, for our international listeners and those that aren't super familiar with American politics, this is before like the parties flip, kind of. So a lot of the Republicans at this time would actually have a lot more in common with Democrats today, especially in the areas of social views.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a it's basically not even worth using the same terms, but very different than what we would talk about today. So with all that background info, let's shift to the voyages of the Richard A. Bingham. Voyages here being plural, but just barely, as we'll see.
a technical thing.
Mm-hmm.
Technically went on more voyages.
That means we need to bring in another character, one who's not a member of the Bingham family, but a close friend. This is Captain Raymond Leslie Merritt.
It's a good captain name. Who
would be in charge of the new vessel. So Merritt's abilities were well known to the Binghams, as he had captained their first ship, the Davy Crockett, from 1899 to 1902. For her first voyage, the Richard A. Bingham would carry a first mate and 3 crew in addition to Merritt. And these were hired on while the ship was being loaded in January 1903.
I feel like that would be more fun to serve on like a boat or a ship where it's that small. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
it's a small crew. You can kind of get to know everyone.
It's probably a little more lax. You know what I mean? Like it doesn't have to be super like rigid. As long as like everyone's cool, right? Like, I mean, if you get a captain who wants to make your life hell, like he definitely could on that small of a boat. But I don't know. I feel like that would be better.
Yeah, and as we talked about, this is a time when, the truly serious business is being done by steam vessels. So even by signing on with one of these sailing vessels, one of these schooners, you kind of already know that this is not going to be a rigid assignment necessarily.
Right.
You're obviously trying to get the job done, but you're not, at the forefront of this shipping industry.
Yeah, you don't have like executives from White Star or Cunard like breathing down your neck, like wondering where you're pinching pennies and stuff.
So I gave away a small part of the story at the very beginning, mentioning that this ship has a very short lifespan. This is an unremarkable schooner built at a time when that wasn't even, noted in the paper. Why are there multiple articles about it at all? The answer to that is the information gained from her financial records, which are an interesting look into accounting practices that were in place at in the shipping industry at the time. So it's of interest to discuss the finances of the trip. That's one aspect where everything is very firmly documented, and it kind of tells the story of the ship as you look through those. Average pay for an ocean-going seaman at the time was about $36 per month.
God, it's crazy how little people got paid back then.
For captains, that was about $125 per month.
I did the math on that 125 number, and in 2022 money, that comes out to like 52 grand, I think.
Wow.
So like not as much as I would expect.
A month?
No, I added that together for like a yearly salary.
Oh, I see. I gotcha.
Not as much as I would expect for like a yearly salary for a sea captain. But I guess you also have to figure that you're at sea for long periods of time, so you're probably not spending much money either. So I don't know. But yeah. I don't know. I would have thought more, but I don't know. It's interesting.
typically also, the captain is getting a cut of the profit. So in addition to his base pay, he's making a little bit extra that the crew aren't going to get.
That makes sense, I guess. Then you start, you can sweeten that up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So despite that, accounting records from the company show that the crew received about half of these average amounts.
Mm-hmm.
The reasoning for that being the Bingham was a schooner and not a steamship. If you served on one of those, that's who got the top pay at the time. That was the real demand. So if you were on one of these sailing ships, you couldn't really expect to make as much money. Also, this is a relatively new company. It's a brand new ship. There's no real cachet attached to it, so they can pay them a little bit less, I would think.
Yeah, I guess you figure if you're working for somewhere like this, you're either just starting out or you're looking for something less intense than one of the bigger companies.
So the Richard A. Bingham departed on her maiden voyage on February 4th, 1903. The ship was bound for Belize, carrying 122,000 board feet of pine lumber and 5,000 shingles. All told, that was worth about $1,800. Also, when I mentioned Belize here, I'm talking about the city of Belize, not necessarily the country that we know today. Though the ship apparently encountered some rough weather on the way, there's nothing really of note, and the Bingham arrived safely at its destination 18 days after leaving Pensacola. Unloading happened over a period of 12 days, after which she was reloaded with mahogany for her return leg. The Bingham arrived back in Pensacola on April 4th and was unloaded by the 11th. After the trip expenditures and Captain Merritt's share of the profit, the trip netted the Binghams $764.
It's just so, the amounts of money are so small, and I love it.
Yeah, it's hard to kind of conceive of, the profitability when you're dealing in, such low numbers. So one of the standard accounting practices demonstrated in the Bingham's financial records is the treatment of outbound and return legs of the trip as totally separate business transactions. So each of these had their own cash accounts and their own list of expenditures. So everything is very itemized, which sounds, I guess, common sense now, but at the time it was kind of a, maybe not revolutionary, but it was kind of a cutting edge thing just to increase the accuracy of these records you're keeping. So also included in those records are some more personal expenses that can kind of tell their own mini stories. For the outbound trip expenses, there are entries of $2.60 for, quote, hospital, and $5 for, quote, man hurt.
Interesting.
So one member of the crew from the outbound trip, Liebersteed, isn't listed on the crew in the return leg, and that might tell the story of why. Whether this was, some sort of injury sustained on the boat, not totally clear. It's not really noted what that is, but those two pieces of data make sense together. Also, a $2.60 hospital visit sounds really sweet.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's crazy. Also, just being able to pay for the hospital visit and not have to go through a bunch of insurers and stuff.
Yeah.
You're not playing the medical bill lottery of just wondering what they're going to send you in the mail.
Mm-hmm.
Or how many bills they're going to send you in the mail. It's also interesting you talking about them separating the trips and, the accounting methods that they're using. This is all before GAAP becomes a thing, which is generally accepted accounting principles. I'm leaning into my business degree a little bit here. That comes along, I think, the first accounting procedures start in the late 30s, and GAAP and those principles are really an invention in the 60s and 70s, I think, of totally standardizing this is how you do accounting. This is standard across the board. So it is interesting that it's the wild, wild west of I don't know what we spent.
Yeah, reading through that accounting history article, reading some things that, even I have rudimentary knowledge of accounting just from the one class I took in college or in high school. And a lot of the stuff struck me as oh, well, this sounds totally normal. And it's well, yeah, now it is. But, at the time, like you just said, there's no rules.
Accounting is the simplest math I've ever done, but also the most frustrating I've ever done. It gets pretty intense at the college level. And I was not an accounting major. I can only imagine where it goes after that.
I think accounting has that appeal that a lot of math does. I'm not a big math fan. I never really was. But what I did like about math is that it's very cut and dry, and that if something is wrong, you know it pretty immediately. If your calculations don't, even out. So there is something elegant about math in the way that you know that there's a problem when one occurs.
The thing that struck me the most in my financial accounting class is the professor, the first thing they said to us in a huge lecture hall was, if you're an accounting major and you don't get an A in this class, I would advise you to change majors. I took my B- and moved on with my day.
Laying down the gauntlet. So as soon as unloading was complete, the Bingham was moved to Parady's Mill and loaded up with 110,000 board feet of lumber, in addition to 2,200 wooden pickets. So only Merritt and one crew member, Bill Hendricks, from the first trip remained with the ship for the second one. Merritt is listed as making $130 for this trip, and Hendricks is listed at $55. Crew members Sherman, Scott, McDonald, and Harvey were signed on for the trip.
Okay.
Interestingly, Hendricks is just listed as Bill in the payroll. Maybe an indication of a, kind of casual working relationship at the company. Other indications of that friendly relationship are that, in the financial books, there's listed advance payments made to crew's family members, with no later indication that these advances were ever deducted from the crewman's pay.
That's interesting.
That doesn't sound normal for a, turn of the century transportation magnate.
No.
I feel like we always hear about these people being very meticulous with, making sure that they keep all of their money. And that kind of stands out as, well, that sounds pretty gracious, I think, for someone of the time.
I mean, it beats like hiring a bunch of Pinkertons to come shoot your workers.
Right? Yeah, he's just kind of like, meh, it's money. Who cares? I got more. So the Bingham left Pensacola on April 20th, this time bound for the Cuban port of Cardenas. After the rough voyage to Belize, the calm weather on this outbound trip was probably pretty welcome. But this eventually went a little bit too far, resulting in the ship being fully becalmed in the Florida Straits. Calm is good, but too calm is not good.
If only there were steamships at this time.
So once the wind picked up again and they neared the destination, storms blew in and prevented them from actually entering the harbor for 3 days, until they were able to finally dock on May 3rd.
They really got the worst of like the weather all the way around there.
So after unloading their cargo, there was no immediate reloading of the ship. So like before, they were basically, is backhauling the term?
Yeah, that is the term. That's what we use in trucking. Loading
back up with something to bring back home. They didn't do that on this trip because they were destined for Florida. So here they're apparently running empty. They docked near the present day location of Fort Myers.
So that's a pretty short trip then. The deadhead portion would be pretty short.
Yeah, so here they loaded up on 10 to 15 tons of phosphates.
Okay. What are phosphates? Is that fertilizer?
I didn't quite know what that meant, like materially, like what are they actually putting in the ship? So phosphates are mined for their uses in fertilizers, is like the main application, and other industrial applications. I learned that Central Florida actually has some of the largest phosphate deposits in North America.
Interesting.
I don't think of Florida as a place where you really mine for stuff, I guess.
Yeah, I think of swamp. Yeah,
so I learned that. Very cool. So the Richard A. Bingham returned to Pensacola and was unloaded by June 6th. So this second round trip netted only a total of $261, with the return leg actually incurring a loss of $20.
It's so weird to think that like the profit loss on a voyage, like I could reach into my wallet and be like, here you go, I'll pay for that.
Yeah, it's funny of like a $20 even being a recorded loss here.
Like I don't think you could really go to like Culver's for $20 for two people now.
So while the overall profit of the second trip was more modest than the first, it would be a lot more successful than the next trip that we'll discuss. So again, on this next voyage, the ship is captained by Merritt.
Okay.
The crew included Bill Hendricks and Sherman from the previous voyage, in addition to newcomers Gomez, Montero, and Drew. Quoting from the article, the ship started out quiet enough, but sometime between June 30th and July 12th, problems arose aboard the Bingham. An entry in the company account book reads, "Mutiny or insane captain on the voyage. 2 men set adrift off Cozumel. Boat lost."
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, it's a very succinct entry that has a lot of stuff in it.
I feel like that's the part where like you're reading through, like, no, I need to know more here. Like, what is this?
I got a question here about this insane captain part. So clearly, at the time of the entry, which is well after the event itself, Bingham himself had very little idea what had happened. There's a almost infinite number of things there between mutiny and insane captain of what possibly could have gone down. This is the only mention of whatever happened in any of the official company logs and accounting records. However, on August 5th, there was a front page story in the Pensacola Daily News on the events of this voyage. So the story detailed the events as told by Bingham's first mate, Bill Hendricks. In the story, the writer relates how Hendricks and Drew, the new addition to the crew, were set adrift by Captain Merritt after he went, quote, insane. The two survived in the ship's yawl for 2 weeks at sea before making landfall. Over this time, the two reportedly sighted other ships on 4 occasions, but they weren't seen. By July 19th, their rations and fresh water were gone, but the following day, they sighted the lighthouse at Cozumel in Mexico, and they got to shore by crashing their boat on the rocks. So how did this happen, was the question. How did it come to be that 2 crew members being set adrift by a captain who had, up to that point, been a pretty good one? He had captained their previous ship, he'd had no issues on this ship before, and then suddenly this happens.
I feel like if this was a Quentin Tarantino movie, it would begin with them like crashing their boat up on the rocks, and then you'd get like 30 different flashes back and like other stories weaving in. This like would be such a great movie where like, it just starts out with these 2 guys like ending up on the beach, and it's like, how did you get here? Yeah,
it's great. So I'll be quoting directly from the article, which quotes in turn from the Pensacola Daily News. Soon after the departure from Pensacola, Captain Merritt called all hands aft on the Bingham and ordered that the first mate, Hendricks, be lashed to the mizzenmast. The Pensacola Daily News described how Merritt's deprivation of rum, it is claimed, afterwards affected the captain's mind, and his state was increased when a knife accidentally dropped from aloft. Gaining the idea that Hendricks was plotting against him, he ordered the mate tied. The next day, he was said to have developed delirium and ordered Drew's hands tied. Several other crazy orders were given.
Is this man just like schizophrenic or something?
There's reference throughout to rum and alcohol, and it seems that rather than it being he's drunk, it seems that it's because he doesn't have access to it.
Oh, okay. He's one of those alcoholics.
Continuing from the article, the men told how Merritt paraded with pistols and a Winchester rifle the next day, threatening first to kill Hendricks and then to cut the tongue out of Drew. Hendricks claimed that he tried to humor Merritt. "All I asked of Captain is to put me on the deck unlashed and shoot me like a man. I don't want to die triced up like a herring."
I do love like the early 1900s like bravado of like, just do it if you're going to do it.
Merritt apparently responded, "I'll do nothing of the kind. I'll do worse than that. I'll give you a ship to command and a crew to serve under you. I'll give you a chance to navigate. Damn your eyes, I'll turn you adrift."
Did he really talk like Mr. Krabs?
Probably. Probably Mr. Krabs mixed with like a Savannah plantation owner, I'm guessing. So despite all this, Hendricks and Drew were just sent to their bunks rather than suffering any of the captain's punishments. Again, I think kind of indicative of Merritt's mind state in that he's making all these big threats. He's starting to cut people's tongues out, and then he just says, go to bed.
That's so weird.
However, in the middle of the night, Merritt reportedly woke up Hendricks telling him, "Montero has just telegraphed you to kill me, but I got ahead of you. I'll knock out your headlights before you can make a move."
I think I take back what I said about serving on a small crew. I think with like a bigger crew, like you'd have enough people that like, you can organize some resistance to this.
Yeah, and especially with a captain like Merritt, where like, he's like very, very close friends with the company owner.
Mm-hmm.
So in any sort of dispute, like, probably Merritt's take on things is going to be the one that's accepted.
Right. Like, I want 20 other guys with me and be like, this man has to sleep at some point, and when he does, like, we're getting him.
Yeah, and again, back to the kind of just like back and forth nature of his behavior here, where he's threatening people, and then he says, well, just go to your cabin, and then he's going into their cabin in the middle of the night. Yeah, you can tell that there's something serious going on here. So the next morning was when Hendricks and Drew were set adrift. So the pair continued on to Belize after landing at Cozumel and reported their predicament to the American consul. So no official investigation was undertaken here because the diplomat didn't feel it was something that he had any jurisdiction over. Above his pay grade.
I am that man. I'm like, I'll help you out, but I'm not getting involved in this.
Yeah. The consul, quote, simply took Hendricks' acknowledgments to the certificate that he left the vessel of his own accord and in accordance with the wishes of all the men concerned. I thought that was a bit odd, that he would, attest to this, but I guess probably to make things work more smoothly. Maybe for legal reasons, he needed to sign it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like everyone just wanted it to kind of go away and not deal with it. That's like the impression I get.
The same consul expressed his opinion that if the ship had indeed been in danger, then Captain Merritt had acted appropriately. He said, Captain Merritt is held in high esteem here, and being considered a hardworking, sober, straightforward man, and as he's been trading here for several years, of course, is well known.
I feel like being sober was the real problem here.
Maybe. Yeah, this is a great example of how Merritt's reputation gave him the benefit of the doubt in any situation like this.
Do we know how old he is at this time?
I don't think I saw anything about his age, but he seems to have been an experienced captain. He's well known here, presumably before just working with the Binghams.
And I would assume, you don't become a captain at 25. So if you're an experienced captain, you have to be fairly old. I just kind of wonder what sort of potential psychological issues and brain issues we're dealing with here, because this man would be studied today, I feel like.
Well, yeah, and because you can see that, because there's no other recorded issues with him before this, that presumably his previous voyages went fine and he didn't display any of this type of behavior. Of course, this is at a time when less things were recorded.
Right.
Fewer things are being written down. So, minute behavioral differences might not have been paid attention to.
Mm-hmm.
A British colonial official credited Merritt with forbearance, claiming that he would have simply killed the mate.
I do love that everyone's just like, yeah, the captain was fine. Yeah, screw that mate.
Mm-hmm. So throughout all of this, Bingham had been informed of issues with the ship's voyage, presumably hearing it most directly from Merritt, the captain. However, despite their connection, there's reason to think that Bingham didn't totally buy the mutiny story. Both of the men in question, Hendricks and Drew, they both received their full expected pay during this time period. Again, another story we can see from the financial records.
Yeah, I don't think I would give full pay to someone who tried to mutiny my ship.
Yeah, so it's even though Bingham does appear to be pretty gracious and generous, with his employees, back to those advance payments, it's really hard to imagine him paying people if he truly believed that they had tried to mutiny on his vessel. Seems like a very easy decision. Also, even the entry itself, how it says mutiny or insane captain. I don't know, 50-50. Bingham himself arrived in Belize to oversee the loading of the schooner for the return trip. The ship was loading mahogany destined ultimately for the Mendel Company of Louisville. Maybe they're making some bats.
Some Louisville sluggers.
Do they make mahogany bats?
I don't think so. I don't think mahogany
doesn't sound like a bat would.
I think ash and maple are the primary ones.
A balsa bat.
A balsa bat.
Just explodes. Bingham named one Albert Debrow as the ship's new captain.
It's a fun name.
It is. I believe Leon is his middle name.
Oh, okay.
I think. Later, he's referred to as Leon, I think.
I would just call him ALD.
And let's see. After getting this new captain, the ship left on July 31st. So even if Bingham had wanted Merritt as captain for the return journey, the captain had apparently already left for the States to, quote, catch Hendricks, and Drew.
Wow. So this man's clearly dealing with some issues.
Yeah, I assume that means he wanted to get ahead of the story back in Pensacola.
But also, like, at this point, he has access to booze. So, like, you would think, right? Like, there's clearly more going on here than, like, this man needs his rum.
Yeah. The Bingham arrived safely back in her home port on August 10th. So after 3 days of quarantine, so standard practice for inspection, fumigation, and monitoring for disease, the ship arrived at Pensacola's railroad wharf for unloading. So despite all the issues on the trip, it still netted $546 for Bingham.
Okay.
So in terms of money, profitable. Remember that front page article had come out on the 5th. So the Bingham's return was a pretty big deal. Merritt was there in person to defend himself and his actions on board the vessel, but was apparently reluctant to tell his whole story because he, quote, could face possible prosecution. So probably smart. I don't know. The article points out that Bingham's competitors probably experienced a good amount of schadenfreude at seeing their Yankee competitor dealing with this embarrassing and widely publicized story.
I would imagine.
All three of the main individuals involved, so Merritt, Hendricks, and Drew, were in Pensacola well before the Bingham's return. So you could kind of imagine each of them, spreading their story their own way, kind of fanning all this gossip into a wildfire before the ship finally arrives. Hey, listeners. Tanner here, cutting in during the editing process. There's a detail to consider here that didn't quite come up organically, but merits mention. It's noted explicitly in the Heier article and in some of the contemporary writing that Drew, the crewman who was set adrift with First Mate Hendricks, was African American. While we can't know exactly what influence race may have had on his treatment by Captain Merritt, given the time and place this story is set in, it seems unlikely that it wouldn't have played some part in being singled out from among the crew of the Bingham. While there are a lot of unknowns in the story of the mutiny on the Bingham, that detail seems at least worthy of pointing out. Now, back to the story. However, Bingham, he just kind of, kept on trucking, and he got the ship ready for its fourth, and unknown to him at the time, final voyage. So the Bingham retained her new captain, Albert de Bro, for this voyage. That's French for Albert the Bro.
Albert the Bro.
So though somewhat surprisingly, this wasn't the end of Bingham's business relationship with Captain Merritt.
Okay.
Merritt was actually put back in charge of his old ship, the Davy Crockett. Wow.
So you try to murder your crew, and it's like, you know what? We're just going to demote you down to the old ship. You go back down to AAA.
Yeah, money will do that. The J.A. Merritt and Company were prominent in Bingham's business dealings, providing shipbroker and consignment services.
Oh.
So you'd have to think that losing this valuable business partner helped to smooth things over between the two.
That makes sense. Money makes you put up with some weird shit.
So by August 18th, the ship was loaded up and ready to sail again. She carried a cargo valued at $1,063, consisting of 125,000 feet of lumber, in addition to doors, sashes, and blinds bound for Belize. So as you can see here, they work with these kind of local lumber companies who they do ship out the raw lumber material. They do also ship out finished goods as well.
Okay.
So a little over a month later, Bingham received a cable informing him that the schooner had reached Frontera, Mexico, with her hold full of water. So ultimately, the ship would spend about a month here fixing what must have been a pretty serious problem. There's an entry of $1,450 that shows up in the ledger, quote, for Frontera, with a separate entry of $227 listed as trip to Frontera.
It's an expensive endeavor.
We will get into the gritty details of that here. When Bingham received that cable informing him that they were in Frontera, he was probably pretty surprised, not just to hear that the ship was leaking so badly, but that they were in Mexico to begin with. That wasn't somewhere that they were supposed to stop. On October 6th, Bingham decided to get down to Frontera himself and see just what the heck is going on with this ship. Writing on his first sight of the ship since she had left Pensacola, he said that she looked, even at a distance, woefully neglected. But there was not a line or spar missing, and I was glad to see her. That last bit is in caps in his journal.
He's very excited.
Captain DeBro explained that the ship had encountered problems not long after leaving Pensacola. DeBro claimed that they had encountered a hurricane, though Bingham definitely didn't buy this, saying, "I do not believe it. Storms do not last 2 weeks, and vessels that encounter gulfs, even new staunch vessels like the Richard, if they live through it, show the scars in the shape of torn sails, broken spars, twisted rails, and smashed boats. The most, I will admit, is she encountered 3 or 4 heavy southwest gales, shown by our weather service, which she was built to weather, and which she did weather." I don't know, part of me thinks it's like kind of splitting hairs, like was it a hurricane or multiple gales?
Yeah, like it could just be bad weather.
But at the same time, he's confident that, like, okay, I don't think that's what happened. This doesn't look like a ship that was in a hurricane for 2 weeks.
This is strangely relevant to the episode we just recorded.
So as he did some more digging, Bingham learned more of the real story. So it was in fact a series of navigational errors on the part of the captain that led the Bingham to a port that he believed was Belize. In fact, they were about 700 miles away.
Close.
The article does kind of throw him a little bit of a bone, saying, okay, both ports are like shadowed by mountains. Okay. But aside from that, a decent navigator would have known that this was not the right place. Quoting here, DeBro still had a chance to redeem himself by bringing the ship into either of Mexico's 2 major deep water ports at Veracruz or Coatzacoalcos. Instead, he made the worst possible choice and picked Frontera. This small Mexican port is not even on the coast, but rather a few miles up the Tabasco River. The sandbar at the mouth of the river had a clearance of only 8 feet, and the Bingham drafted 10. If it had any hope of getting over the sandbar and entering the port, the ship had to be lightened. Ironically, the Bingham was closer to the deepwater port of Coatzacoalcos, about 50 miles to the north, than to Frontera, but Captain DeBro's decision had been made. So to even enter the harbor at Frontera, DeBro had to get help from the local American consular agent, Arthur Game. This agent was, I guess, somewhat unsurprisingly for the time, in league with a local Mexican official to charge inflated rates and split the profit.
I love that everyone has their grift.
Never a better time to be corrupt, I feel like.
Yeah.
Like, you're an American agent, you're in Mexico, like, who's going to stop you? So about a third of the ship's cargo was removed. The service costing about $1,800, which seems steep just to take some stuff off of a ship.
I guess they were like, who else is going to do it? It costs what it costs.
And the ship was brought into Frontera, where DeBro immediately used up all remaining cash reserves to supply and house his crew.
At least he took care of the crew.
Better than the last captain. So it's at this point that DeBro cabled Bingham to inform him of their plight. This is that cable that Bingham received, telling him, hey, we're in Frontera. So as we said earlier, Bingham arrived in October to Frontera, by which time the debts incurred had been compounded to about $4,500. And this is noted that this is in Mexican dollars. I don't know what the exchange rate is here. Bingham had arrived with only $750 in cash and a few letters of credit sewn into his pockets.
I love it. Back in the day, you show up with a letter, be like, no, I'm good for it.
I have this sewn into my coat. And you'd kind of have to think that he's probably arriving with what he thinks is like more than enough money.
Right.
He seems like a pretty prudent business owner. He's probably coming what he thinks is over prepared. But no, not at all. Unfortunately for Bingham, the major creditor in all these expenses was the local businessman Don Pepe Poch.
That just sounds like someone that would be a little like local business tyrant in Mexico, doesn't it?
Don Pepe. He is described by Bingham as a, quote, American-hating Spaniard.
Oh, no.
I will say, granted, at this point in history, this is 1903, so based on when the Spanish-American War was, there's probably a lot of American-hating Spaniards in circulation.
I mean, I'm just glad he didn't use a slur.
Right, that's probably the best thing he could have called him. Describing Don Pepe, Bingham writes, "He is the rich man of the place. He owns a little iron steamer that carries cattle from Frontera to Progreso, and money, in caps, from Progreso to Frontera. Also, he owns a steam tug and 2 American-built schooners. From the way he stands on his wharf and gazes at the Richard, I imagine he thinks he will own her."
Little businessman envy right here.
I guess, and when you put it in comparison, like, Don Pepe has more assets than Bingham does.
Yeah, I think he thought he was going to Mexico to deal with like some like uneducated locals, and he gets there and he's like, "Oh, this is like a real businessman."
Right. So to get out of this predicament, Bingham used the local business landscape to his advantage. We know he's good at making connections with people. So working with a Mr. Richards, who described himself as an enemy of the consul, so this is that American consul, the two put together a false bill of sale as a way to bring Don Pepe and the consul to the table. It's basically making them worried that he was going to sell it to this other person so that they kind of lower their demands. To start paying off debts, Bingham visited a local banker, Don Felipe Palenque, to make use of his letters of credit. So this was at first actually refused. Don Felipe looks in his little, banking directory, which is quite old, and he's looking for Bingham. He's looking for anything listing his institution in Pensacola, and he can't find it because it's out of date. So at first he says, "No, I don't know who you are. I don't know what this credit is even worth. It's going to be about 2 months. Let me collect on this first letter of credit, and then, we can start moving your money."
That's crazy how slow money moves at the time.
Obviously, that was unacceptable to Bingham, who every day his ship is in Frontera, he's racking up these fees just for having it at the wharf. He's paying for stuff for his men, and of course, he's paying it at these exorbitant, increased rates. So at this point, in his meeting with the banker, when he's been kind of turned away, Bingham noticed a portrait hanging on Don Felipe's wall. A portrait of George Armstrong Custer.
What? What?
It's weird, I know. So he asks about it. He says, "Oh, that's interesting." And Don Felipe explains that Custer was a hero of his.
Why?
Let's not pull too hard at that thread for right now, I think. So Bingham was very happy to inform Don Felipe that his own father had served under Custer during the Civil War.
2 things. One, if I had to serve under Custer, I'm definitely picking the Civil War as a time to do it.
Right.
Not the Plains Wars. 2, did his father actually serve with Custer, or is he lying?
I tried to look into this, and when I searched for both on the Plains and before that, Custer in relation to any sort of Bingham, I couldn't find anything definitive of someone serving under him. But again, if this was like a common soldier, I don't know where that would even be recorded.
Right. You could be so far removed from him, but him still be like the commander of your,
right.
Battalion or regiment or something.
When he was on the Plains, there was a Bingham that he worked with as one of the local reservation agents. And then also, and then also actually one of the, I believe the local person who wrote him his recommendation for West Point, I believe was a John Bingham. I don't know. That was I think John Bingham was from Ohio, but it's possible that could have been who he's referring to.
Yeah, plus it's the 1900s. Like, who's going to check?
Yeah, exactly. He can't Google this and find out. So I'm just going to tell him, "Hey, yeah, I've got a connection to your hero here." So this led to a little bit more relaxed atmosphere, and this banker agreed to accept Bingham's letters of credit. Amazing what could, get your foot in the door here.
George Armstrong Custer, a global force for good.
Yes. Bingham eventually got everything paid off, resulting in those previously mentioned entries in the accounting books. $1,450 for ship-related expenses, and that $227 was for his own personal trip to Frontera. The Bingham finally left Frontera on November 7th and reached her destination, Belize. on November 26th. She encountered gales on her way around the Yucatan, but survived them largely unscathed. Oh, that's another thing I was going to point out with the distance here. They arrive in Frontera thinking maybe this is the right place. They're on the wrong side of the Yucatan Peninsula.
I was actually looking at the map and I was like, I don't think that's
way, way off base. So she unloaded what remained of her pine cargo and took on mahogany, which kept her in port for about 2 weeks. And here we see the last, final indignity of the Richard A. Bingham. The day after leaving on her homeward journey, the Bingham struck a reef outside Belize Harbor. Crewman Jack Graham described it as follows. When out of piece, she was caught in the storm and was backed up on a reef, going down and completely wrecking herself. The crew managed to save themselves with difficulty and remained in the water nearly all night, finally making their way to Belize. So after less than a year in operation, the Richard A. Bingham's career was over. The crew all eventually did return safely to Pensacola aboard the Norwegian steamer Hydra.
It's always a risk when you're on that Norwegian steamer.
Yeah. Thank you, Norway. So what's interesting about the final voyage is how the ship was crewed. So typically, we've seen the ship had a crew of 6 or 7. And payroll on the final trip indicates that she only had a crew of 4. So that's including the captain, Albert DeBro, Jack Graham, who we just heard from, Henry Pace, and Lieberstein, who's that crew member from the very first one where he was left behind because he got hurt.
Okay.
So he apparently rejoined at some point. If she encountered a storm and she was 2 or 3 crews short of her expected minimum, obviously that can contribute to why she would have been wrecked. The financial fallout from this total loss of the Bingham was described as staggering. All told, the loss of the ship had cost Bingham about $7,000. According to a note in that article, the modern value of this $7,000 would be well within the $1 million range. So to give us a sense of how much money he's losing here. Bingham's personal financial records show a decrease in net worth from $8,330 on August 20th, 1903 to just $1,440 on December 31st. That is a decrease of over 80% in his business assets.
I think what I will say that I like about this is his business had a loss, and the biggest person that's affected is him. Like the way it's supposed to be, right? Like he's not doing a bunch of financial maneuvering to get out of it. Like he's out the money.
Mm-hmm.
He took a risk and it didn't pay off.
There's no bailout coming for him here.
Yeah. I like that. I'm okay with this.
And Bingham actually took this surprisingly well. He was an experienced businessman, so loss is probably not unfamiliar to him. But this would have been a massive hit to his, business endeavors. He is quoted as saying, "And the missus, she said it made her mad, such a fine ship to be wrecked and going to ruin because of the captain's carelessness. I told her there was no use in getting mad about it." So it's very cool. Both of them, actually, the owner himself and his wife, she's mad not that they're losing money, but the fact that, this is such a wonderful ship and it's lost.
It's still the 1900s. He's like, settle down, you hysterical woman.
So between his employee relationships and his laid back attitude to this enormous financial loss, Bingham strikes me as probably the most normal turn of the century businessman we've read about.
Yeah, he seems like a pretty all right guy.
He seems just like a normal dude. Bingham's experiences didn't sour his love for the sea, as he continued sailing on his yacht, Peep-a-Day. He would actually publish stories about his cruises for Pensacola readers, and it's kind of interesting to see that this sort of, acceptance by the locals. They're still reading his stuff, later on, kind of probably accepting him, as someone who has, he's one of us now. He's been through the ups and downs, of the lumber trade, this industry that's such a big part of what Pensacola is, and kind of accepting him as one of their own. Bingham also did continue in the lumber trade, acquiring the ships Carrie A. Buckman and City of Baltimore.
Okay.
By 1913, Bingham had started a company that would build ships for the American and French navies in World War I. He dabbled in some real estate. He became director of the Pensacola Finance Company. All in all, we can't feel too sorry for Fraser Bingham.
Yeah, he sounds like an all right guy who things kind of worked out pretty good for him overall.
Yeah. Ultimately, he died in 1953. The article rounds things up as follows. The early 20th century was an era of political, social, and technological transition for the United States. It was against this historical backdrop that F. Bingham experienced some of his greatest challenges and triumphs, as recorded in his journals and accounting ledgers. But the records of the Richard A. Bingham also provide a biography of his ship that evidenced the rise of West Florida lumber and shipping industries, the maritime trade patterns of the Gulf of Mexico, and the unpredictability that surrounded entrepreneurship as the American century opened.
Yeah, that's it's just a really interesting story. There's so much going on, and like the shipwreck is kind of like tangential at parts of this, but it's interesting.
I like how that closes, talking about this in the context of the American century, and how this is 1903. This is well before the U.S. is what it becomes on the world stage, and I think it's interesting to see that in the way that these things are treated. This American ship is stranded in Belize, and the locals sort of line up to take advantage of it and sort of screw with the crew and overcharge them for things. Whereas you think about the same type of thing happening 20 or 30 years later, and I feel you got to think there's no way Mexico is doing this to an American craft.
Yeah, there's it's a lot more equitable almost, I feel like, in like the interactions with Mexico and Belize and stuff. There's not the little brother aspect of it the way that we look at it now.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really fascinating portrait of the day, and just what's going on.
I know I had said that Quentin Tarantino maybe, but actually I'm changing my mind. I want this to be a Wes Anderson film. I think it would be amazing.
I could see that.
William Dafoe can be the crazy captain.
He'd be very good at that.
Yes, he would.
All right. Well, that's all I've got for us here. That'll wrap up our bonus episode. We'll get this one out here soon. And anything else? No,
I think that's it. This was a really interesting one. This is like the perfect kind of story I like for the bonus episodes, where it's definitely shipwreck adjacent and the shipwreck plays an important part, but like there's so much more going on.
Cool. All right. Well, that'll be a wrap for this episode. We hope you enjoyed this one, and we will be talking to you soon.